I got one viewer. I'm assuming it's Eric. I got Louie here ready. And we're just waiting for somebody to take out the trash. Oh, a normal response. Wow. That's new. You ran out of nonsense words or whatever those were. Words in other languages. Okay, Louise settled on my lap. It's been just over 2 months since I last did a reading, so I will make sure to do a recap of where we left off when Stephen gets back, when he gets here. Yeah, it's been a while, so I understand forgetting something like that. Are you nice and comfy, tucked right there in between? He's on my lap and like squished up between these pillows that are propping up everything, that are also on my lap. And here comes Bagheera. I don't know if he's going to make an appearance on camera though. He doesn't like the camera as much as Louie does. Oh, you are just so sweet, licking my hand. Just out of frame. Oh, you can see his ears out here, maybe. You're a good boy. Time to take out the trash. There's probably something really exciting going on that we can't see. I would have just waited to start the video, but like I was literally going live right when he sent that. So I was like, alright, I'll just vamp. Can't take that long. Right? I'm gonna make you sit up. Yeah, see, all kinds of things happen when you're not online, when you're not doing this for a while. He's like, why? I was so comfortable. Why are you doing this? You're helping me kill time. He looks so happy, doesn't he? Okay. Alright, get back on my lap then. Yeah, he's back down on my lap where he was. That's your spot. You want to stay right there, huh? He just doesn't like being held. I'm always holding him against his will. There's not much he can do about it because he's so tiny. So he just lets it happen. But he's not happy about it. I feel like I could... They're dice earrings. Yeah, I got these at, what's it called? Back in the before time. The board game convention. Not... Yeah, the one that's here. The only one that's here. In LA. Strategicon. There's Steven. Yeah, I got these at Strategicon in the little, you know, like... What's it? The area where people sell things. That one. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I went live right as you were telling us you'd be right back, so I was like, well, I'll just keep it going. So, what, to recap, because it's been 2 months, yeah, I don't know if that's what they call it, Vendor's Hall. I forgot what they call it. There's a name for it, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, the one it's 3 times a year, every 3-day weekend. I think they just brought it back. I feel like they did it over Labor Day weekend. But it's usually Labor Day weekend, President's weekend, and Memorial weekend. And there's different ones. They're called different things, I mean. Strategicon is the name of the whole thing, and then there's... Oh, I used to know the 3 different names. I go every time. I go 3 times a year for like 2 years or something. But it's just been so long. Anyway, it's also been a bit of time since we last did this. So, where we left off, Both was at learning about the Adem. Ademra is the language or something. And learning, taking care of like, oh, there goes the cat. Shut up, Blue. Yes, it was at the LAX Hilton. This chat is moderated? I don't know. Anyway, he's learning about these people and learning to fight and all this stuff and doing his trial for all that, all the things that he's been doing. And we left off with one of those stories within the story. The last thing was when she was, when she being, what's her face? See, I'm forgetting names and everything. Shane, right? That one. She was telling him the story of the 7 names. So that was a bit, he was like naming his sword and all this stuff. And so this 7 names have been remembered, the names of the 7 traitors. Remember them and know them by their 7 signs. Scythus bears the blue flame, Stersis is in thrall of iron, Ferul, chill and dark of eye, Usnia lives in nothing but decay, Grey Dalcenti never speaks, Pale Alenta brings the blight, Laster is the lord of 7, hated, hopeless, sleepless, sane, Alaxel bears the shadow's hame. Just in case that's important later, I figured I'd recap that. That was where we left off. That was the last thing we heard back in July, like on July 19th. Now we're on chapter 129. Interlude, Din of Whispering. Reshi! Bast cried out, his face stricken. No, stop! He held out his hands as if he would press them against the innkeeper's mouth. You shouldn't say such things. Both smiled in a humorless way. Bast, who taught you your name lore in the first place? Not you, Reshi. Bast shook his head. There are things every Fey child knows. It's never good to speak such things aloud. Not ever. And why is that? Kvoth prompted in his best teacher's voice. Because some things can tell when their names are spoken, Bast swallowed. They can tell where they're spoken. Kvoth gave a somewhat exasperated sigh. There's small harm in saying a name once, Bast. He sat back in his chair. Why do you think the Adem have their traditions surrounding that particular story? Only once and no questions after? Bast's eyes narrowed thoughtfully, and Kvoth gave him a small, tight smile. Exactly. Trying to find someone who speaks your name once is like tracking a man through a forest from a single footprint. Chronicler spoke up hesitantly, as if afraid of interrupting. Can such a thing really be done? He asked. Truthfully? Kvoth nodded grimly. I expect that's how they found my troop when I was young. Chronicler looked around nervously, then frowned and made an obvious effort to stop. The result was that he sat very still, looking every bit as nervous as before. I don't know what a hame is. I was wondering that too. And yeah, I feel like that happens sometimes, so maybe. But also there are a lot of Sarahs, so it's very possible I do hear my name. It's just not directed at me. Does that mean they might come here? You've certainly been talking about them enough. Kvoth made a dismissive gesture. No, names are the key. Real names. Deep names. And I have been avoiding them for just that reason. My father was a great one for details. He had been asking questions and digging up old stories about the Chandrian for years. I expect he stumbled onto a few of their old names and worked them into his song. Understanding washed over Chronicler's face. And then rehearsed it again and again. The innkeeper gave a faint, fond smile. Endlessly, if I knew him at all. I have no doubt he and my mother did their solid best to work every tiny burr out of their song before they made it public. They were perfectionists. He gave a tired sigh. To the Chandrian, it must have been like someone constantly lighting a signal fire. I expect the only thing that kept them safe for so long was that we were constantly traveling. Bast broke in again. Which is why you shouldn't say such things, Reshi. Kvothe frowned. I have slept my 1,000 nights and traveled several thousand miles since then, Bast. It is safe to say them once. With all the hell that's breaking loose in the world these days, you can believe people are telling old stories more often. If the Chandrian are listening for names, I don't doubt they've got a slow din of whispering from Arua to Circle C. Bast's expression made it clear he was less than reassured. Besides, Kvothe said with a bit of a weary sigh, it's good to have them written down. They may prove useful to someone someday. Still, Reshi, you should be more careful. What have I been these last years except for careful, Bast? Kvothe said, his irritation finally bubbling to the surface. What good has it done me? Besides, if what you say about the Thea is true, then things will end in tears no matter what I do, isn't that right? Bast opened his mouth, then closed it, obviously at a loss. Then he darted a look toward Chronicler, his eyes pleading for support. Seeing this, Kvothe turned to look at Chronicler as well, raising an eyebrow curiously. I'm sure I don't know in the least, Chronicler said, looking down as he opened the satchel and brought out an ink-stained piece of cloth. Both of you have seen the full extent of my naming prowess. Iron. And that is a fluke by all accounts. Master Namer declared me an utter waste of his time. That sounds familiar, Kvothe murmured. Chronicler shrugged. In my case, I took him at his word. Can you remember the excuse he gave you? He had many specific criticisms. I knew too many words. I'd never been hungry. I was too soft. Chronicler's hands were busy cleaning the nib of his pen. I felt he made his overall position clear when he said, Who would have thought a papery little scriv like you could have any iron in him at all? Kvothe's mouth quirked into a sympathetic smile. Did he really? Chronicler shrugged. He called me a twat, actually. I was trying not to offend the innocent ears of your young friend here. He nodded at Bast. From what I can tell, he's had a rough day. Kvothe smiled in full now. It's a shame we weren't ever at the university at the same time. Chronicler gave the nib one last rub against the soft cloth and held it up to the fading light from the inn's window. Not really, he said. You wouldn't have liked me. I was a papery little twat, and spoiled, and full of myself. And what's changed since then? Kvothe asked. Chronicler blew air through his nose dismissively. Not much, depending who you ask, but I like to think I've had my eyes opened a bit. He screwed the nib carefully back into his pen. And how did that happen exactly? Kvothe asked. Chronicler looked across the table, seeming surprised at the question. Exactly? He asked. Telling a story isn't what I'm here for. He tucked the cloth back into his satchel. In brief, I had a snit and left the university looking for greener pasture. Best thing I ever did. I learned more from a month on the road than I had in 3 years of classes. Kvothe nodded. Tecum said the same thing. No man is brave that has never walked 100 miles. If you want to know the truth of who you are, walk until not a person knows your name. Travel is the great leveler, the great teacher. Bitter as medicine, crueler than mirror glass. A long stretch of road will teach you more about yourself than 100 years of quiet introspection. That's what I was thinking too. It is like Beetlejuice. Except instead of 3 times, it's like you'd have to say the name more like 300 times. Chapter 130. Wine and Water. Saying my farewells in Hert took an entire day. I shared a Jesus Christ. Someone walks upstairs, it feels like an earthquake. I shared a meal with Vachette and Tempe and let both of them give me more advice than I needed or desired. Celine cried a bit, and she told me she would come visit me when she finally took the red. We bouted one final time, and I suspect she let me win. Lastly, I spent a pleasant evening with Penth that turned into a pleasant night, and eventually into a pleasant late night. I did manage to catch a few hours of sleep in the pale hours before dawn. I grew up among the Rue, so I'm endlessly amazed how quickly a person can put down roots in a place. Though I had been in Hert less than 2 months, it was hard to leave. Still, it felt good to be back on the road again, heading toward Alvaron and Denna. It was time I collected my reward for a job well done and delivered an earnest and rather belated apology. 5 days later, I was walking one of those long, lonely stretches of road you only find in the low hills of eastern Ventus. I was, as my father used to say, on the edge of the map. I had only passed 1 or 2 travelers all day, and not a single inn. The thought of sleeping outdoors wasn't particularly troubling, but I had been eating from my pockets for a couple days, and a warm meal would have been a welcome thing. Night had nearly fallen, and I had given up hope of something decent in my stomach when I spotted a line of white smoke trailing into the twilight sky ahead of me. I took it for a farmhouse at first. Then I heard a faint strain of music, and my hopes for a bed and a hearth-hot meal began to rise. But as I came around a curve in the road, I found a surprise better than any roadside inn. Through the trees I saw a tall campfire flickering between two achingly familiar wagons. Men and women lounged about, talking. One strummed a lute, while another tapped a small tabor? I don't know what that word is. Idly against his leg. Others were pitching a tent between two trees, while an older woman set a tripod over the fire. Troopers. What's better, I recognized familiar markings on the side of one of the wagons. To me, they stood out more brightly than the fire. Those signs meant these were true troopers. My family, the Edema Ruh. As I stepped from the trees, one of the men gave a shout, and before I could draw breath to speak, there were 3 swords pointing at me. The sudden stillness after the music and chatter was more than slightly unnerving. A handsome man with a black beard and a silver earring took a slow step forward, never taking the tip of his sword off my eye. "Otto!" he shouted into the woods behind me. "If you're napping, I swear on my mother's milk I'll gut you. Who the hell are you?" The last was directed at me, but before I could respond, a voice came out of the trees. "I'm right here, Oleg, as—" "Who's that? How in God's name did he get past me?" When they'd drawn their swords on me, I'd raised my hands. It's a good habit to have when anyone points something sharp at you. Nevertheless, I was smiling as I spoke. "Sorry to startle you, Oleg." "Save it," he said coldly. "You have 1 breath left to tell me why you were sneaking around our camp." I had no need to talk, and instead turned so everyone by the fire could see the loot case slung across my back. The change in Oleg's attitude was immediate. He relaxed and sheathed his sword. The others followed suit as he smiled and approached me, laughing. I laughed too. One family. One family. He shook my hand and turned toward the fire, shouting, "Best behavior, everyone! We have a guest tonight!" It was a low cheer, and everyone went busily back to whatever they had been doing before I arrived. Maybe a tabor is the same thing as a haim. Gotta find out what these things are. A thick-bodied man wearing a sword stomped out of the trees. "I'll be damned if he came past me, Oleg. He's from our family," Oleg interjected smoothly. "Oh," Otto said, obviously taken aback. He looked at my loot. "Welcome, then." "I didn't go past, actually," I lied. When it was dark, my shade made me very difficult to see, but that wasn't his fault, and I didn't want to get him in trouble. "I heard the music and circled around. I thought you might be a different troop, and I was going to surprise them." Otto gave Oleg a pointed look, then turned and stomped back into the woods. Oleg pulled his arm around my shoulders. "Might I offer you a drink?" "A little water, if you can spare it." "No guest drinks water by our fire," he protested. "Only our best wine will touch your lips." "The water of the edema is sweeter than wine to those who have been upon the road," I smiled at him. "Then have water and wine, each to your desire." He led me to one of the wagons, where there was a water barrel. Following a tradition older than time, I drank a ladle of water and used a second to wash my hands and face. Patting my face dry with the sleeve of my shirt, I looked up at him and smiled. "It's good to be home again." He clapped me on the back. "Come, let me introduce you to the rest of our family." First were 2 men of about 20, both with scruffy beards. "Fren and Josh are our 2 best singers, excepting myself, of course." I shook their hands. Next were the 2 men playing instruments around the fire. "Gaskin plays lute. Laren does pipes and tabor." Okay, I thought tabor was an instrument, like something like a tambourine I'm picturing. They smiled at me. Laren struck the head of the tabor with his thumb, and the drum made a yellow tum. Okay, it's not a tambourine, but it is a type of hand drum. Now we just need to know what a haim is. "There's Tim," Oleg pointed across the fire to a tall, grim man oiling a sword. "And you've already met Otto. They keep us from falling into danger on the road." Tim nodded, looking up briefly from his sword. "This is Anne." Oleg gestured to an older woman with a pinched expression and gray hair pulled back in a bun. "She keeps us fed and plays mother to us all." Anne continued to cut carrots, ignoring both of us. "And far from last is our own sweet Keat, I'm going to say Keat, who holds the key to all our hearts." Keat had hard eyes and a mouth like a thin line, but her expression softened a little when I kissed her hand. It helps that I'm a musician, I don't know. For that one, at least. For that specific thing. I was like, aha! Musician mind helping. Okay. And that's everyone, Oleg said with a smile and a little bow. Your name is? Kvoth. Welcome, Kvoth. Rest yourself and be at your ease. Is there anything we can do for you? A bit of that wine you mentioned earlier? I smiled. He touched the heel of his hand to his forehead. Of course! Or would you prefer ale? I nodded, and he fetched me a mug. Excellent, I said after tasting it, seating myself on a convenient stump. He tipped an imaginary hat. Thank you. We were lucky enough to nick it on our way through Levenshire a couple days ago. How has the road been treating you of late? I stretched backward and sighed. Not bad for a lone minstrel, I shrugged. I take advantage of what opportunities present themselves. I have to be careful since I'm alone. Oleg, Gaskin, and Tim. There's always like that one person with the normal name. I stretched backward and sighed. Oh wait, I already read that. Oleg nodded wisely. The only safety we have is in numbers, he admitted, then nodded to my lute. Would you favor us with a bit of a song while we're waiting for Anne to finish dinner? There's also Ange. That's a normal name, too. Certainly, I said, setting down my drink. What would you like to hear? Can you play Leave the Town, Tinker? Can I? You tell me. I lifted my lute from its case and began to play. By the chorus, everyone had stopped what they were doing to listen. I even caught sight of Otto near the edge of the trees as he left his lookout to peer toward the fire. When I was done, everyone applauded enthusiastically. You can play it, Oleg laughed. Then his expression became serious, and he tapped a finger to his mouth. How would you like to walk the road with us for a while? He asked after a moment. We could use another player. I took a moment to consider it. Which way are you heading? Easterly, he said. I'm bound for Severin, I said. Oleg shrugged. We can make it to Severin, he said, so long as you don't mind taking the long way around. I have been away from the family for a long time, I admitted, looking at the familiar sights around the fire. One is a bad number for an edema on the road, Oleg said persuasively, running a finger along the edge of his dark beard. I sighed. Ask me again in the morning. He slapped my knee, grinning. Good! That means we have all night to convince you. I replaced my lute and excused myself for a call of nature. Coming back, I knelt next to Anne where she sat near the fire. What are you making for us, Mother? I asked. Stew, she said shortly. I smiled. What's in it? Anne squinted at me. Lamb, she said, as if daring me to challenge the fact. It's been a long while since I've had lamb, Mother. Could I have a taste? You'll wait, same as everyone else, she said sharply. Not even a small taste? I wheedled, giving her my best ingratiating smile. The old woman drew a breath, then shrugged it away. Fine, she said, but it won't be my fault if your stomach sets to aching. I laughed. No, Mother, it won't be your fault. I reached for the long-handled wooden spoon and drew it out. After blowing on it, I took a bite. Mother, I exclaimed, this is the best thing to touch my lips in a full year. She said, squinting at me. It's the first truth, Mother, I said earnestly. Anyone who does not enjoy this fine stew is hardly one of the roux, in my opinion. Anne turned back to stir the pot and shooed me away, but her expression wasn't as sharp as it had been before. After stopping by the keg to refill my mug, I returned to my seat. Gaskin leaned forward. You've given us a song. Is there anything you'd like to hear? You've given us a song. Is there anything you'd like to hear? How about Piper Wit? I asked. His brow furrowed. I don't recognize that one. It's about a clever roux who outwits a farmer. Gaskin shook his head. I'm afraid not. I bent to pick up my lute. Let me. It's a song every one of us should know. Pick something else, Laren protested. I'll play you something on the pipes. You've played for us once already tonight. I smiled at him. I forgot you piped. You'll like this one, I assured him. Piper's the hero. Besides, you're feeding my belly. I'll feed your ears. Before they could raise any more objections, I started to play, quick and light. They laughed through the whole thing, from the beginning when Piper kills the farmer to the end when he seduces the dead man's wife and daughter. I left off the last two verses where townsfolk kill Piper. Lauren wiped his eyes after I was done. Or Laren. Heh, you're right, Kvoth. I'm better off knowing that one. Besides, he shot a look at Keat, where she sat across the fire. It's an honest song. Women can't keep their hands off a piper. Keat snorted derisively and rolled her eyes. We talked of small things until Anne announced the stew was done. Everyone fell to, breaking the silence, only to compliment Anne on her cooking. It does sound like a funny song. I wish I could hear it. Honestly, Anne, Oleg asked after his second bowl, did you lift a little pepper back in Levenshire? Anne looked smug. We all need our secrets, dear, she said. Don't press a lady. I asked Oleg, have times been good for you and yours? Oh, certainly, he said between mouthfuls. 3 days ago, Levenshire was especially good to us. He winked. You'll see how good later. I'm glad to hear it. In fact, he leaned forward conspiratorially, we've done so well that I feel quite generous. Generous enough to offer you anything you'd like. Anything at all. Ask and it's yours. He leaned closer and said in a stage whisper, I want you to know this is a brilliant attempt to bribe you into staying on with us. We would make a thick purse off that lovely voice of yours. Not to mention the songs he could teach us, Gaskin chimed in. Oleg gave us a mock snarl. Don't help him bargain, boy. I have the feeling this is going to be hard enough as it is. I gave it a little thought. I suppose I could stay. I let myself trail off uncertainly. Oleg gave a knowing smile. But I would ask for 3 things. 3 things. He looked me up and down. Just like in one of the stories. It only seems right, I urged. He gave a hesitant nod. I suppose it does. And how long would you travel with us? Until no one objects to my leaving. Does anyone have any problem with this? Oleg looked around. What if he asks for one of the wagons? Tim asked. His voice startled me, harsh and rasping like 2 bricks grating together. It won't matter, as he'll be traveling with us, Oleg argued. They belong to all of us anyway, and since he can't leave unless we say so... There were no objections. Oleg and I shook hands, and there was a small cheer. Keat held up her mug. To Kvoth and his songs, she said. I have a feeling he'll be worth whatever he costs us. Everyone drank, and I held up my own glass. I swear on my mother's milk none of you will ever make a better deal than the one you made with me tonight. This evoked more enthusiastic cheer, and everyone drank again. Wiping his mouth, Oleg looked me in the eye. So what is the first thing you want from us? I lowered my head. It's a little thing, really. I don't have a tent of my own. If I'm going to be traveling with my family... Say no more! Oleg waved his wooden mug like a king granting a boon. You'll have my own tent, piled with furs and blankets a foot deep. He made a gesture over the fire to where Fren and Josh sat. Go set it up for him. That's all right, I protested. I can manage it myself. Hush, it's good for them. Makes them feel useful. Speaking of which, he made another gesture at Tim. Bring them out, would you? Tim stood and pressed a hand to his stomach. I'll do it in a quick minute. I'll be right back. He turned to walk off into the woods. I don't feel very good. That's what you get for eating like you're at a trough, Otto called after him. He turned back to the rest of us. Someday he'll realize he can't eat more than me and not feel sick afterward. Since Tim's busy planting a tree, I'll go get them, Lauren said with thinly veiled eagerness. I'm on guard tonight, Otto said. I'll do it. I'll get them, Keat said, exasperated. She stared the other 2 back into their seats and walked behind the wagon on my left. Josh and Fren came out of the other wagon with a tent, ropes, and stakes. Where do you want it? Josh asked. That's not a question you usually have to ask a man, is it, Josh? Fren joked, nudging his friend with an elbow. I tend to snore, I warned them. You'll probably want me a little away from everyone else. I pointed. Over between those 2 trees would be fine. I mean, with a man, you normally know where they want it, don't you, Josh? Fren continued as they wandered off and began to string up the tent. Keat returned a minute later, leading a pair of lovely young girls. One had a lean body and face, with straight black hair cut short like a boy's. The other was more generously rounded, with curling golden hair. Both wore hopeless expressions and looked to be about 16. Meet Krim and Ellie, Keat said, gesturing to the girls. Oleg smiled. They are one of the ways in which Levenshire was generous to us. Tonight, one of them will be keeping you warm. My gift to you as the new member in our family. He made a show of looking them over. Which one would you like? Yikes. I looked from one to the other. That's a hard choice. Let me think on it a little while. Keat sat them near the edge of the fire and put a bowl of stew in each of their hands. The girl with the golden hair, Ellie, ate woodenly for a few bites, then slowed to a stop like a toy winding down. Her eyes looked almost blind, as if she were watching something none of us could see. Crin's eyes, on the other hand, were focused fiercely into the fire. She sat stiffly with her bowl in her lap. Girls, Oleg chided, don't you know that things will get better as soon as you start cooperating? Ellie took another slow bite, then stopped. Kryn stared into the fire, her back stiff, her expression hard. From where she sat by the fire, Anne prodded at them with her wooden spoon. "Eat!" The response was the same as before. One slow bite, one tense rebellion. Scowling, Anne leaned closer and gripped the dark-haired girl firmly by the chin. Her other hand reached for the bowl of stew. "Don't!" I urged. "They'll eat when they get hungry enough." Oleg looked up at me curiously. "I know what I'm talking about. Give them something to drink instead." The old woman looked for a moment as if she might continue anyway, then shrugged and let go of Kryn's jaw. "Fine. I'm sick of force-feeding this one anyway. She's been nothing but trouble." Keat sniffed in agreement. "Little bitch came at me when I untied her for her bath," she said, brushing her hair away from the side of her face to reveal scratch marks. "Almost took out my damn eye." "Did a runner, too," Anne said, still scowling. "I've had to start doping her at night." She made a disgusted gesture. "Let her starve if she wants." Laren came back to the fire with 2 mugs, setting them in the girl's unresisting hands. "Water?" I asked. "Ale," he said. "It'll be better for them if they aren't eating." I stifled my protest. Ellie drank in the same vacant manner in which she had eaten. Kryn moved her eyes from the fire, to the cup, to me. I felt an almost physical shock at her resemblance to Denna. Still looking at me, she drank. Her hard eyes gave away nothing of what was happening inside her head. "Bring them over to sit by me," I said. "It might help me to make up my mind." Keat brought them over. Ellie was docile. Kryn was stiff. "Be careful with this one," Keat said, nodding to the dark-haired girl. "She's a scratcher." Tim came back looking a little pale. He sat by the fire, where Otto nudged him with an elbow. "Want some more stew?" he asked maliciously. "Sod off," Tim rasped weakly. "A little ale might settle your stomach," I advised. He nodded, seeming eager for anything that might help him. Keat fetched him a fresh mugful. By this time the girls were sitting on either side of me, facing the fire. Closer, I saw things I had missed before. There was a dark bruise on the back of Kryn's neck. The blonde girl's wrists were merely chafed from being tied, but Kryn's were raw and scabbed. For all that, they smelled clean. Their hair was brushed and their clothes had been washed recently. Keat had been tending to them. They were also much more lovely up close. I reached out to touch their shoulders. Kryn flinched, then stiffened. Ellie didn't react at all. From off in the direction of the trees, Friend called out, "It's done. Do you want us to light a lamp for you?" "Yes, please," I called back. I looked from one girl to the other and then to Oleg. "I cannot decide between the two," I told them honestly, "so I will have both." Oleg laughed incredulously. Then, seeing I was serious, he protested. "Oh, come now, that's hardly fair to the rest of us. Besides, you can't possibly—" I gave him a frank look. "Well," he hedged, "even if you can, this is the second thing I ask for," I said formally. "Both of them." Otto made a cry of protest that was echoed in the expressions of Gaskin and Laren. I smiled reassuringly at them. "Only for tonight." Friend and Josh came back from setting up my tent. "Be thankful he didn't ask for you, Otto," Friend said to the big man. "That's what Josh would have asked for, isn't it, Josh?" "Shut your hole, Friend," Otto said, exasperated. "Now I feel ill." I stood and slung my lute over one shoulder. Then I led both lovely girls, one golden and one dark, toward my tent. Chapter 131. Black by Moonlight. Friend and Josh had done a good job with the tent. It was tall enough to stand in the center, but still crowded with me and the girls standing. I gave the golden-haired one, Ellie, a gentle push toward the bed of thick blankets. "Sit down," I said gently. When she didn't respond, I took her by the shoulders and eased her into a sitting position. She let herself be moved, but her blue eyes were wide and vacant. I checked her head for any signs of a wound. Not finding any, I guessed she was in deep shock. I took a moment and dug through my travel sack, then shook some powdered leaf into my traveling cup and added some water from my water skin. I set the cup into Ellie's hands, and she took hold of it absently. "Drink it," I encouraged, trying to capture the tone of voice Valurian had used to gain my thoughtless compliance from time to time. It may have worked, or perhaps she was just thirsty. Whatever the reason, Ellie drained the cup to the bottom. Her eyes still held the same far-away look they had before. I shook another measure of the powdered leaf into the cup, refilled it with water, and held it out for the dark-haired girl to drink. We stayed there for several minutes, my arm outstretched, her arms motionless at her sides. Finally she blinked, her eyes focusing on me. "What did you give her?" she asked. "Crushed velia," I said gently. "It's a countertoxin. There was poison in the stew." Her eyes told me she didn't believe me. I didn't eat any of the stew. It was in the ale, too. I saw you drink that. Good, she said. I want to die. I gave a deep sigh. It won't kill you. It'll just make you miserable. You'll throw up and be weak with muscle cramps for a day or two. I raised the cup, offering it to her. What do you care if they kill me? She asked tonelessly. If they don't do it now, they'll do it later. I'd rather die. She clenched her teeth before she finished the sentence. They didn't poison you. I poisoned them, and you happened to get some of it. I'm sorry, but this will help you over the worst of it. Kryn's gaze wavered for a second, then became iron-hard again. She looked at the cup, then fixed her gaze on me. If it's harmless, you drink it. I can't, I explained. It would put me to sleep, and I have things to do tonight. Kryn's eyes darted to the bed of furs laid out on the floor of the tent. I smiled my gentlest, saddest smile. Not those sorts of things. She didn't move. We stood there for a long while. I heard a muted retching sound from off in the woods. I sighed and lowered the cup. Looking down, I saw Ellie had already curled up and gone to sleep. Her face looked almost peaceful. I took a deep breath and looked back up at Kryn. You don't have any reason to trust me, I said, looking straight into her eyes. Not after what has happened to you. But I hope you will. I held out the cup again. She met my eyes without blinking, then reached for the cup. She drank it off in one swallow, choked a little, and sat down. Her eyes stayed hard as marble as she stared at the wall of the tent. I sat down, slightly apart from her. In 15 minutes she was asleep. I covered the two of them with a blanket and watched their faces. In sleep they were even more beautiful than before. I reached out to brush a strand of hair from Kryn's cheek. To my surprise, she opened her eyes and stared at me. Not the marble stare she had given me before. She looked at me with the dark eyes of a young Denna. I froze with my hand on her cheek. We watched each other for a second. Then her eyes drew closed again. I couldn't tell if it was the drug pulling her under or her own will surrendering to sleep. I settled myself at the entrance of the tent and lay Caesura across my knees. I felt rage like a fire inside me, and the sight of the two sleeping girls was like a wind fanning the coals. I set my teeth and forced myself to think of what had happened here, letting the fire burn fiercely, letting the heat of it fill me. I drew deep breaths, tempering myself for what was to come. I waited for 3 hours, listening to the sounds of the camp. Muted conversation drifted toward me, shapes of sentences with no individual words. They faded, mixing with cursing and sounds of people being ill. I took long, slow breaths as Vachette had shown me, relaxing my body, slowly counting my exhalations. Then, opening my eyes, I looked at the stars and judged the time to be right. I slowly unfolded myself from my sitting position and made a long, slow stretch. There was a solid crescent of moon hanging in the sky, and everything seemed very bright. I approached the campfire slowly. It had fallen to sullen coals that did little to light the space between the two wagons. Otto was there, his huge body slumped against one of the wheels. I smelled vomit. "Is that you, Cloth?" he asked blurrily. "Yes." I continued my slow walk toward him. "That bitch Anne didn't let the lamb cook through," he moaned. "I swear to holy God I've never been this sick before." He looked up at me. "Are you all right?" Caesura leapt, caught in the moonlight briefly on her blade, and tore his throat. He staggered to one knee, then toppled to his side, his hands staining black as they clutched his neck. I left him bleeding darkly in the moonlight, unable to cry out, dying but not dead. I tossed a piece of brittle iron into the coals of the fire and headed toward the other tents. Laren startled me as I came around the wagon. He made a surprised noise as he saw me walk around the corner with my naked sword. But the poison had made him sluggish, and he had barely managed to raise his hands before Caesura took him in the chest. He choked a scream as he fell backward, writhing on the ground. None of them had been sleeping soundly due to the poison, so Laren's cry set them pouring from the wagons and tents, staggering and looking around wildly. Two indistinct shapes that I knew must be Josh and Fren leapt from the open back of the wagon closest to me. I struck one in the eye before he hit the ground and tore the belly from the other. Everyone saw, and now there were screams in earnest. Most of them began to run drunkenly into the trees, some falling as they went. But the tall shape of Tim hurled itself at me. The heavy sword he had been sharpening all evening glinted silver in the moonlight. But I was ready. I slid a second long, brittle piece of sword iron into my hand and muttered a binding. Then, just as he came close enough to strike, I snapped the iron sharply between my fingers. His sword shattered with the sound of a broken bell, and the pieces tumbled and disappeared in the dark grass. Tim was more experienced than me, stronger, and with longer reach. Even poisoned, with half a sword, he made a good showing of himself. It took me nearly half a minute before I snuck past his guard with lever out the window and severed his hand at the wrist. He fell to his knees, letting out a raspy howl and clutching at the stump. I struck him high in the chest and headed for the trees. The fight hadn't taken long, but every second was vital, as the others were already scattering into the woods. I hurried in the direction I'd seen one of the dark shapes stagger. I was careless, so when a leg threw himself on me from the shadow of a tree, he caught me unaware. He didn't have a sword, only a small knife flashing in the moonlight as he dove for me, but a knife is enough to kill a man. He stabbed me in the stomach as we rolled to the ground. I struck the side of my head against a root, and tasted blood. I fought my way to my feet before he did, and cut the hamstring on his leg. Then I stabbed him in the stomach and left him cursing on the ground as I went to hunt the others. I held one hand tight across my stomach. I knew the pain would hit me soon, and after that I might not have long to live. It was a long night, and I will not trouble you with any further details. I found all the rest of them as they made their way through the forest. Anne had broken her leg in her reckless fight, and Tim made it nearly half a mile despite the loss of his hand and the wound in his chest. They shouted and cursed and begged for mercy as I stalked them through the forest, but nothing they said could appease me. It was a terrible night, but I found them all. There was no honor to it, no glory, but there was justice of a sort, and blood, and in the end I brought their bodies back. I came back to my tent as the sky was beginning to color to a familiar blue. A sharp, hot line of pain burned a few inches below my navel, and I could tell from the unpleasant tugging when I moved that dried blood had matted my shirt to the wound. I ignored the feeling as best I could, knowing I could do nothing for myself with my hands shaking and no decent light to see by. I'd have to wait for dawn to see how badly I was hurt. I tried not to dwell on what I knew from my work in the Medica. Any deep wound to the gut promises a long, painful trip to the grave. A skilled physicker with the right equipment could make a difference, but I couldn't be farther from civilization. I might as well wish for a piece of the moon. I wiped my sword, sat in the wet grass in front of the tent, and began to think. Okay, so, I could probably do one more chapter. One or two. There's 2 short chapters left if you want me to keep going. Because that was, a lot just happened. And it's been a while, so we could keep going for a bit. As long as you guys don't have things to do. Or something. Hey, Victor. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Alright. Chapter 132. The Broken Circle. I had been busy for more than an hour when the sun finally peered over the tops of the trees and began to burn the dew from the grass. I had found a flat rock and was using it as a makeshift anvil to hammer a spare horseshoe into a different shape. Above the fire, a pot of oats was boiling. I was just putting the finishing touches on the horseshoe when I saw a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. It was Kryn peeking around the corner of the wagon. I guessed I'd woken her with the sound of hammering iron. Oh my God! Her hand went to her mouth and she took a couple stunned steps out from behind the wagon. You killed them! Yes, I said simply, my voice sounding dead in my ears. Kryn's eyes ran up and down my body, staring at my torn and bloody shirt. Art, her voice caught in her throat and she swallowed. Are you all right? I nodded silently. When I'd finally worked up the courage to examine my wound, I discovered that Valerian's cloak had saved my life. Instead of spilling open my guts, Oleg's knife had merely given me a long, shallow cut across my belly. He had also ruined a perfectly good shirt, but I had a hard time feeling bad about that, all things considered. I examined the horseshoe, then used a damp leather strap to tie it firmly to one end of a long, straight branch. I pulled the kettle of oats off the fire and thrust the horseshoe into the coals. Seeming to recover from some of her shock, Kryn slowly approached, eyeing the row of bodies on the other side of the fire. I had done nothing other than lay them out in a rough line. It wasn't tidy. Blood stained the bodies, and their wounds gaped openly. Kryn stared as if she were afraid they might start to move again. What are you doing? She asked finally. In answer, I pulled the now-hot horseshoe from the coals of the fire and approached the nearest body. It was Tim. I pressed the hot iron against the back of his remaining hand. The skin smoked and hissed and stuck to the metal. After a moment I pulled it away, leaving a black burn against his white skin. A broken circle. I moved back to the fire and began to heat the iron again. Kryn stood mutely, too stunned to react normally. Not that there could be a normal way to react in a situation like this, I suppose. But she didn't scream or run off as I thought she might. She simply looked at the broken circle and repeated, "What are you doing?" When I finally spoke, my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "All of the Adima-Rua are one family," I explained, "like a closed circle. It doesn't matter if some of us are strangers to others. We are still family, still close. We have to be this way, because we are always strangers wherever we go. We are scattered, and people hate us. We have laws, rules we follow. When one of us does a thing that cannot be forgiven or mended, if he jeopardizes the safety or the honor of the Adima-Ru, he is killed and branded with the broken circle to show he is no longer one of us. It is rarely done. There is rarely a need." I pulled the iron from the fire and walked to the next body, Otto. I pressed it to the back of his hand and listened to it hiss. These were not Adima-Ru, but they made themselves out to be. They did things no Adima would do, so I'm making sure the world knows they were not part of our family. The Ru do not do the sort of things that these men did. "But the wagons," she protested. "The instruments." "They were not Adima-Ru," I said firmly. "They probably weren't even real troopers, just a group of thieves who killed a band of Ru and tried to take their place." Kryn stared at the bodies, then back at me. "So you killed them for pretending to be Adima-Ru?" "For pretending to be Ru? No." I put the iron back in the fire. For killing a Ru troop and stealing their wagons? Yes. For what they did to you? Yes. But if they aren't Ru, Kryn looked at the brightly painted wagons. How? "I am curious about that myself," I said. Pulling the broken circle from the fire again, I moved to Oleg and pressed it into his palm. The false trooper jerked and screamed himself awake. "He isn't dead!" Kryn exclaimed shrilly. I had examined the wound earlier. "He's dead," I said coldly. "He just hasn't stopped moving yet." I turned to look him in the eye. "How about it, Oleg? How did you come by a pair of Adima wagons?" "Ru bastard," he cursed at me with a blurry defiance. "Yes," I said, "I am. And you are not. So how did you learn my family's signs and customs?" "How did you know?" he asked. "We knew the words, the handshake. We knew water and wine and songs before supper. How did you know?" "You thought you could fool me?" I said, feeling my anger coiling inside me again like a spring. "This is my family. How could I not know? Ru don't do what you did. Ru don't steal, don't kidnap girls." Oleg shook his head with a mocking smile. There was blood on his teeth. "Everyone knows what you people do." My temper exploded. "Everyone thinks they know. They think rumor is the truth. Ru don't do this." I gestured wildly around me. "People only think those things because of people like you." My anger flared even hotter, and I found myself screaming. "Now tell me what I want to know, or God will weep when he hears what I've done to you." Oleg paled and had to swallow before he found his voice. "There was an old man and his wife and a couple other players. I traveled guard with them for half a year. Eventually they took me in." He ran out of breath and gasped a bit as he tried to get it back. He'd said enough. "So you killed them." Oleg shook his head vigorously. "No. We were attacked on the road." He gestured weakly to the other bodies. "They just surprised us. The other players were killed, but I was just knocked out." I looked over the line of bodies and felt the rage flare up, even though I'd already known. There was no other way these people could have come by a pair of Adima wagons with their markings intact. Oleg was talking again. "I showed them afterward how to act like a troop." He swallowed against the pain. "Good life." I turned away, disgusted. He was one of us in a way, one of our adopted family. It made everything 10 times worse, knowing that. I pushed the horseshoe into the coals of the fire again, then looked to the girl as it heated. Her eyes had gone to flint as she watched Oleg. Not sure if it was the right thing to do, I offered her the brand. Her face went hard, and she took it. Oleg didn't seem to understand what was about to happen until she had the hot iron against his chest. He shrieked and twisted, but lacked the strength to get away as she pressed it hard against him. She grimaced as she struggled weakly against the iron, her eyes brimming with angry tears. It was the Tim guy that gave it all away. He heard Tim, and he was like, "Wait a minute." After a long minute, she pulled the iron away and stood, crying quietly. I let her be. Oleg looked up at her and somehow managed to find his voice. "Ah, girl, we had some good times, didn't we?" She stopped crying and looked at him. "Don't." I kicked him sharply in the side before he could say anything else. He stiffened in mute pain and then spat blood at me. I landed another kick, and he went limp. Not knowing what else to do, I took back the brand and began heating it again. There was a long silence. Is Ellie still asleep? I asked. Corinne nodded. I think I gave myself a paper cut. Like a really tiny invisible one. Do you think it would help her to see this? She thought about it, wiping at her face with a hand. I don't think so, she said finally. I don't think she could see it right now. She's not right in her head. The two of you are from Levenshire? I asked to keep the silence at arm's length. My family farms just north of Levenshire, Corinne said. Ellie's father is mayor. When did these come into your town? I asked as I set the brand to the back of another hand. The sweet smell of charred flesh was becoming thick in the air. What day is it? I counted in my head. Felling. They came into town on Thaden, she paused. 5 days ago? Her voice was tinged with disbelief. We were glad to have the chance to see a play and hear the news. Hear some music. She looked down. They were camped on the east edge of town. When I came to get my fortune read, they told me to come back that night. They seemed so friendly, so exciting. Corinne looked at the wagons. When I showed up, they were all sitting around a fire. They sang me songs. The old woman gave me some tea. I didn't even think. She looked like my gran. Her eyes strayed to the body of the old woman. Then away. Then I don't remember what happened. I woke up in the dark in one of the wagons. I was tied up and Her voice broke a little, and she rubbed absent-mindedly at her wrists. She glanced back at the tent. I guess Ellie got an invitation, too. I finished branding the backs of their hands. I had been planning to do their faces, too, but the iron was slow to heat in the fire, and I was quickly growing sick of the work. I hadn't slept at all, and the anger that had burned so hot for so long was in its final flicker, leaving me feeling cold and numb. I made a gesture to the pot of oats I'd pulled off the fire. Are you hungry? Yes, she said, then darted a look toward the bodies. No. Me neither. Go wake up Ellie and we can get you home. Corinne hurried off to the tent. After she disappeared inside, I turned to the line of bodies. Does anyone object to my leaving the troop? I asked. None of them did, so I left. Okay, let's stop giving ourselves paper cuts, everybody. Let's all agree. No more paper cuts. Okay. And this one's also kind of short, so we'll do one more. Chapter 133, Dreams. It was an hour's work to drive the wagons into a thick piece of forest and hide them. I destroyed their edema markings and unhitched the horses. There was only one saddle, so I loaded the other 2 horses with food and whatever other portable valuables I could find. When I returned with the horses, Corinne and Ellie were waiting for me. More precisely, Corinne was waiting. Ellie was merely standing nearby, her expression vacant, her eyes empty. Do you know how to ride? I asked Corinne. She nodded, and I handed her the reins to the saddled horse. She got one foot in the stirrup and stopped, shaking her head. She brought her foot back down slowly. I'll walk. Do you think Ellie would stay on a horse? Corinne looked over to where the blonde girl was standing. One of the horses nuzzled her curiously and got no response. Probably, but I don't think it would be good for her. After... I nodded in understanding. We'll all walk then. What is the heart of the Lithani? I asked Bichette. Success and right action. Which is the more important, success or rightness? They are the same. If you act rightly, success follows. But others may succeed by doing wrong things, I pointed out. Wrong things never lead to success, Bichette said firmly. If a man acts wrongly and succeeds, that is not the way. Without the Lithani, there is no true success. Sir? A voice called. Sir? My eyes focused on Corinne. Her hair was windblown, her young face tired. She looked at me timidly. Sir, it's getting dark. I looked around and saw twilight creeping in from the east. I was bone-weary and had fallen into a walking doze after we had stopped for lunch at midday. Just call me Quoth, Corinne. Thanks for jogging my elbow. My mind was somewhere else. Corinne gathered wood and started a fire. I unsaddled the horses, then fed and rubbed them down. I took a few minutes to set up the tent, too. Normally I don't bother with such things, but there had been room for it on the horses, and I guessed the girls weren't used to sleeping out of doors. After I finished with the tent, I realized I'd only brought one extra blanket from the troop's supplies. There would be a chill tonight, too, if I was any judge of such things. Dinner's ready, I heard Corinne call. I tossed my blanket and the spare one into the tent and headed back to where she was finishing up. She'd done a good job with what was available. Potato soup with bacon and toasted bread. There was a green summer squash nestled into the coals as well. Ellie worried me. She had been the same all day, walking listlessly, never speaking or responding to anything Corinne or I said to her. Her eyes would follow things, but there was no thought behind them. Corinne and I had discovered the hard way that if left to herself she would stop walking or wander off the road if something caught her eye. Corinne handed me a bowl and spoon as I sat down. "It smells good," I complimented her. She half smiled and dished a second bowl for herself. She started to fill a third bowl, then hesitated, realizing Ellie couldn't feed herself. "Would you like some soup, Ellie?" I asked in normal tones. "It smells good." She sat blankly by the fire, staring into nothing. "Do you want to share mine?" I asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I moved closer to her and blew on a spoonful to cool it. "Here you go." Ellie ate it mechanically, turning her head slightly in my direction, toward the spoon. Her eyes reflected the dancing patterns of the fire. They were like the windows of an empty house. I blew on another spoonful and held it out to the blonde girl. She opened her mouth only when the spoon touched her lips. I moved my head, trying to see past the dancing firelight in her eyes, desperately hoping to see something behind them. Anything. "I bet you're an L, aren't you?" I said conversationally. I looked at Corinne. "Short for Ellie?" Corinne shrugged helplessly. "We weren't friends, really. She's just Ellie Anwater, the mayor's daughter." "It sure was a long walk today," I continued, speaking in the same easy tone. "How do your feet feel, Corinne?" Corinne continued to watch me with her serious dark eyes. "A little sore." "Mine too. I can't wait to get my shoes off. Are your feet sore, Elle?" No response. I fed her another bite. "It was pretty hot, too. It should cool off tonight, though. Good sleeping weather. Won't that be nice, Elle?" No response. Corinne continued to watch me from the other side of the fire. I took a bite of soup for myself. "This is truly fine, Corinne," I said earnestly, then turned back to the vacant girl. "It's a good thing we have Corinne to cook for us, Elle. Everything I cook tastes like horse shit." On her side of the fire, Corinne tried to laugh with a mouthful of soup with predictable results. I thought I saw a flicker in Elle's eyes. "If I had some horse apples, I could make us a horse apple pie for dessert," I offered. "I could make some tonight if you want." I trailed off, making it a question. Elle gave the slightest frown. A small wrinkles creased her forehead. "You're probably right," I said. "It wouldn't be very good. Would you like more soup instead?" The barest nod. I gave her a spoonful. "It's a little salty, though. You probably want some water." Another nod. I handed her the water skin, and she lifted it to her own lips. She drank for a long, long minute. She was probably parched from our long walk today. I would have to watch her more closely tomorrow to make sure she drank enough. "Would you like a drink, Corinne?" "Yes, please," Corinne said, her eyes fixed on Elle's face. Moving automatically, Elle held the water skin out toward Corinne, holding it directly over the fire with the shoulder strap dragging in the coals. Corinne grabbed it quickly, then added a belated, "Thank you, Elle." I kept the slow stream of conversation going through the whole meal. Elle fed herself toward the end of it, and though her eyes were clearer, it was as if she were looking at the world through a sheet of frosted glass, seeing but not seeing. Still, it was an improvement. After she ate 2 bowls of soup and half a loaf of bread, her eyes began to bob closed. "Would you like to go to sleep, Elle?" I asked. A more definite nod. "Should I carry you to the tent?" Her eyes snapped open at this, and she shook her head firmly. "Maybe Corinne would help you get ready for bed if you asked her." Elle looked in Corinne's direction. Her mouth moved in a vague way. Corinne darted a glance at me, and I nodded. "Let's go and get tucked in, then," Corinne said, sounding every bit the older sister. She came over and took Elle's hand, helping her to her feet. As they went into the tent, I finished off the soup and ate a piece of bread that had been too badly burnt for either of the girls. Before too long, Corinne came back to the fire. "Is she sleeping?" I asked. Before she hit the pillow. "Do you think she will be all right?" She was in deep shock. Her mind had stepped through the doors of madness to protect itself from what was happening. "It's probably just a matter of time," I said tiredly, hoping it was the truth. "The young heal quickly." I chuckled humorlessly as I realized she was probably only about a year younger than me. I felt every year twice tonight, some of them 3 times. Despite the fact that I felt covered in lead, I forced myself to my feet and helped Corinne clean the dishes. I sensed her growing unease as we finished cleaning up and repicketing the horses to a fresh piece of grazing. The tension grew worse as we approached the tent. I stopped and held the flap open for her. "I'll sleep out here tonight." Her relief was tangible. "Are you sure?" I nodded. She slipped inside, and I let the flap fall closed behind her. Her head poked back out almost immediately, followed by a hand holding a blanket. I shook my head. "You'll need them both. There'll be a chill tonight." I pulled my shade around me and lay directly in front of the tent. I didn't want Elle wandering out during the night and getting lost or hurt. Won't you be cold? I'll be fine, I said. I was tired enough to sleep on a running horse. I was tired enough to sleep under a running horse. Corinne ducked her head back into the tent. Soon I heard her nestling into the blankets. Then everything was quiet. I remembered the startled look on Otto's face as I cut his throat. I heard a leg struggle weakly and curse me as I dragged him back to the wagons. I remembered the blood, the way it had felt against my hands, the thickness of it. I had never killed anyone like that before. Not coldly, not close up. I remembered how warm their blood had been. I remembered the way Keat had cried as I stalked her through the woods. "It was them or me!" she had screamed hysterically. "I didn't have a choice! It was them or me!" I lay awake a long while. When I finally slept, the dreams were worse. Alright, I'm going to end it there. And, yeah, we're getting close to the end. This is like the last few chapters. There's just about 15 more chapters left. So yeah, we should be finishing up fairly soon. I think maybe Friday was the next night that you guys were both possibly going to be able to tune in. So maybe we'll aim for that day. It's good to be back to it. It's been a while. Thanks for waiting. Thanks, Victor. Good to hear from you. Yeah. I hope we don't have to either wait a really long time or like not ever get a third book. And I hope it's not too terrible of a cliffhanger. Although there are many people who have already waited 10 years or something like that. So we can't be too mad. Alright, have fun watching Power Rangers, Steven. Okay. Good night, guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.